If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so many more. You can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and have fun.
I'm so excited and I just can't fight it. I'm about to puff, pass, and I like it.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This week we have Emma Chasen, cannabis educator and industry consultant. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Emma Chasen, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on. So you're the first person I'm interviewing for our Women in Cannabis Month, and I'm really excited to have you on so you can share a little bit about what you do and educate people who might not know what they need to.
Yay. Wow, such an honor that I'm the first.
You really are. Yes, swear skis. So Emma, please share a little bit about yourself and how you got into the cannabis industry.
Sure. So really my journey into the cannabis industry itself begins with what I studied in undergrad. So I was able to design my own kind of curriculum and track within the biology department. And so what I landed on was medicinal plant research and ethnobotany. And what that means, especially the ethnobotany part, is really studying the way in which indigenous peoples have used folk medicine and plant medicine ritualistically in their healing practices. And so always have been interested in plant medicine, especially looking through like the folk traditional lens. And after I graduated, I took a job at an oncology research group where I was coordinating clinical oncology trials nationwide. And I just became very disillusioned with the cancer industry, given that it is, an industry. And so there is a bottom line and it's driven by profits. And that just didn't sit right with me and what I wanted to do. And so I quit and I somehow convinced my best friend to move across the country with me to Portland. It was sight unseen. We'd never been there before. And we rented a house for a month and just kind of tried it on. And I needed a job very badly at the time. And serendipitously, I arrived. This was in August of 2015. And so the cannabis industry there was transitioning from medical to adult use. And so all of the dispensaries were hiring, and I took a job as a bud tender. Again, very serendipitously arrived or landed at a dispensary that took a more scientific approach to cannabis. And I thought, okay, I'll be here for like a couple months until I find something better. But I ended up loving it. I loved the way in which, I was able to explain cannabis and cannabis compounds to people who had no idea, what to even ask at the time. And so I quickly kind of became the general manager of that shop. But that's when I began to really notice this kind of pervasive problem within the industry, which is this lack of education. And so I just thought to myself, watching bud tenders and retail associates kind of go onto the sales floor and try to engage with people who are asking questions that their doctors couldn't even answer. I was like, how could we not have a comprehensive training program that, looked at the fundamental elements of cannabis science, but then also looked at empathetic patient care? To not have that training program to me was such a disservice to the industry and also a liability for the business when, again, people were coming with questions that healthcare providers were not willing to answer / could not answer at the time. And so that's when I really began my mission-driven work of like, okay, I'm going to fill this void. I'm going to create accessible, digestible resources rooted in scientific evidence around cannabis and its purported effects for the industry itself. So that way they can go out and best educate consumers. And after leaving the dispensary, I really focused on, translating that kind of work into a full comprehensive course curriculum and program. And in order to do that, obviously I needed funding, but I didn't want to take any outside investment. And so I started my consulting company, where I began working kind of one-on-one with businesses and different clients to be able to generate revenue to produce this online school. And after many kind of market tests and iterations, the online school does exist. It lives out there on the internet and people can go take courses. It's all module based. And so it doesn't really take much of my full-time management, which is nice, but the resources are there and I'm really proud of it. And then my kind of biggest consulting project to date was this past year. I lived in Oklahoma City for a little while and I created a dispensary for clients down there. So everything from the kind of conceptualization of the brand identity through the construction, through hiring, training, inventory acquisition, and opening doors. But still my love in this industry definitely resides in providing people with reputable scientific resources that make sense to them, that really help them feel empowered to navigate kind of consuming cannabis and integrating it into their lifestyle in ways that will most benefit them.
That's awesome. That is way in depth. You have so much knowledge. I'm so excited to pick your brain. So what would you say that the most rewarding part of what you do is within the industry?
Definitely this piece of education. I think that working with people, especially in newer markets who are just so passionate and excited to be bringing this to the constituents of their states. So thinking about, I have a client that I've worked with in the past in Missouri, and people in Missouri, and speaking to them are like, we never thought that this would be here. Like, sure, we saw Colorado and Oregon and California, but never thinking that Missouri would bring medical cannabis to people. And so their mission and drive and excitement to be able to bring good information to the people of Missouri is really, really inspiring and definitely very heartfelt. And that's where I, love my work and being able to provide them with at least a roadmap, to be able to speak about cannabis in a way that, again, just helps people like better understand it and ultimately get to a better experience for themselves.
Right. So, I mean, ultimately your title could be many things because there's so much to it. How would you define your role within the realm?
That's a great question that I admittedly haven't been asked yet on any podcast. So I really like that. Thank you. I really come back to educator. I mean, I've thrown around like consultant and various other kind of business related terms, but ultimately what I love to do is educate. And I don't necessarily see myself as like a scientist or a researcher, though I am currently in a master's program right now, getting my MS in medical cannabis science and business. So I'm diving a little bit more into the research side than I have in a while since I've been in academia. But as far as like my role in the industry and kind of what I hope to, how I hope to see my role evolve in the future, I think that it'll always come back to this piece of education, providing this bridge between the scientific community and the research that's out there to the lay community, whether they be in the industry or be a consumer.
Interesting indeed. I love that. So I've read that you reject indica or sativa binary, instead focus on, correct me if I'm wrong, is it chemotypes?
Correct.
Cool.
Very good.
Please help me understand that process and how you realized that that was the direction of study that you wanted to focus on.
Sure. So really when it comes down to kind of what I teach within the industry, the way in which I help people kind of better predict experience ultimately for consumers when they're looking to consume cannabis really comes down to this like base philosophy that the indica and sativa binary system that we've been operating in to really point us towards a specific effect or experience is not going to help anybody when it comes to getting them what they want. And when I teach and I kind of tell my students the story, I go back to the creation of these names. So in 1753, Carl Linnaeus, father of modern taxonomy, it was during the Age of Enlightenment. So really philosophers and scientists were beginning to kind of question that the church had all the answers for everything. And Linnaeus in particular was really focused around how do we classify organisms based on shared characteristics to better understand the natural world. And he is the one who came up with the term sativa. He's the one who classified cannabis as a genus and sativa as a species. And then 30 years later, another taxonomist by the name of Lamarck was traveling in India, and he saw a species of cannabis that looked different enough morphologically from the sativa. And it's important to note that when Linnaeus classified sativa, he only spoke of its morphological characteristics. So it grows tall and skinny, it has these narrow leaf, it has loose female flowers. At no point do we know that he rolled up a joint of cannabis sativa and was like, oh my God, I'm so energized right now. That wasn't part of the original definition. And so when Lamarck 30 years later encountered this cannabis plant, he was like, oh, wow, okay, it grows way different than the sativa. It's short and bushy and it has broad leaves and dense female flowers. And I think it warrants another kind of species classification. And I'm in India, so I'm going to call it indica. And again, at no point do we know of Lamarck rolling up some cannabis indica and being like, oh my God, I'm totally melting in the couch right now. And so on a kind of foundational level, it is nonsensical to kind of subscribe experience when the definition is rooted in morphology, rooted in the way in which plants grow. But even if at one point the indica plant had, a certain set of compounds that made people feel sleepier when they smoked it, and the sativa plant had a certain set of compounds that made people feel more energized when they smoked it, it doesn't really matter right now where we're at, because most everything on the current market is hybridized in some way or another. And that really comes from prohibition. So this last century of unchecked breeding with no kind of, scientific records or accounts being held, everything being done underground, it led to incredible genetic diversity. So the cannabis pool has quite a range of diverse genetics, which is awesome when it comes to different secondary compounds that we're looking to elevate and use for its therapeutic properties. But it definitely makes it harder to be able to classify the plant, especially when we're looking to classify it based on the experience that it might create for its consumer. And so really the only thing then that we can look to in order to best predict the experience that a consumer will have from a particular cannabis variety are the chemical compounds within the matrix of that particular batch of flower. And so when I say the chemical compounds, I'm talking about the cannabinoids and the terpenes, most notably. And there are many more compounds at work that we don't really even know what their influence might be on physiology. There are over 500 compounds currently within cannabis's matrix, 120 of those being cannabinoids and just over 200 being terpenes. And so there are many more at play. But right now, the data that we do have access to from analytical testing laboratories are the cannabinoids and the terpenes. And those, from research, we know have an impact on physiology. And they are most likely the ones that are really driving the kind of nuanced experience that someone might feel from a particular cannabis variety.
That's like more information than I've ever known in my entire life. That is like, you talk about getting a crinkle in a brain. I
just threw a lot. I did throw a lot.
That was like, no, but it was so fascinating. And I'm really proud of how well you say cannabinoids, because I'm always like rolling over that one. And you said it like 6 or 7 times really quickly. And I'm like, damn, that's good.
A lot of practice. A lot of practice.
Really good. So do you have a favorite way of consuming cannabis? And do you have any particulars about the way that you consume? And how is it that you choose what to consume?
So I do have a favorite way right now. It's I'm not saying that this is a good way to consume, but in the efforts of radical honesty, I've been really, really enjoying spliffs, mixing some cannabis with a little bit of tobacco and then some other medicinal herbs. It's just like the most relaxing thing to me at the end
Nice.
of a long day. And so I love that. I also do love edibles right now. Like where I'm at in life, I'm not in so much of an edible mood, but I feel like definitely moving into the winter, like edibles are very cozy and just like stay home in my blanket kind of mode.
Mm-hmm.
The most important thing to me when I'm considering what to consume is one dose. So especially when it comes to edibles, how
Right.
easily can I measure my dose? I definitely hate the feeling of being too high, as most people do. And so when I started working in the industry, I was like, oh yeah, like I can eat 50 milligrams of THC and like be totally chill. And now I'm like, if I go above 5 milligrams of THC, I don't want it.
Right.
I want something that's low and slow and small. And when it comes to flower, really looking at the way in which it is grown is so important to me. I feel like I know almost too much from all of the kind of work and research that I've been doing, where I know, certain pesticides that are even legal and that growers use can transform into really toxic compounds when heated and inhaled. I know like the different fertilizers that growers can use can just turn into horrible, nasty stuff again when heated and inhaled. And to me, I feel really like grateful, but also spoiled that I've lived in Oregon for so long, because the cannabis there is so like beautiful and bountiful, and so many growers really prioritize organics and looking at like organic living soil and feeding the soil and the microbiome and like just wonderful farming practices that lead to, in my experience and opinion, just beautiful flower that tastes delicious, that feels delicious, and that isn't putting any nasty stuff in your body. And so since moving back east, that's definitely been more of a challenge, but also like is almost a crusade for me, where it's like I will not smoke anything that is not grown in such a way that really not only prioritizes the flower, of course, but that also really has the person who's smoking it at the end of all of this in mind, and using only the most beautiful inputs from the earth.
So this is just like a side question. Like, would you say that like if done legally, like you would tell or suggest someone to grow it on their own in the right conditions, or would you still kind of suggest to buy from a farm? Or
I think that anybody who feels called to it should grow on their own.
okay.
Absolutely. I think that it's such a beautiful experience to connect yourself to your medicine and really like get to know the plant, because she has such a personality, and I think she's so like funky and sweet and lovely. And I also totally am a believer that like plants are very intelligent beings, and so they not only are soaking in whatever like organic inputs that you're feeding it, but that also they're soaking in their energetic environment and what that feels like and looks like. And so if you are cultivating a plant very lovingly, I do believe that somehow is downloaded and expressed in its tissues. And so, yes, I think that anybody who feels called to it should totally do it. It is not easy. I've tried it before myself, and is a labor of love. And I did outdoor. I didn't like do the indoor setup, and it wasn't easy. And it like, didn't produce like the best, like most like, top shelf worthy cannabis, but it was still really fun. And I had a great time, and it definitely was not bad when consuming it at the end of it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I always wanted to try to like grow a little thing, but in my mind, I think it's gonna end up like taking over like bamboo shoots everywhere. Like, and then I'm in big trouble because I keep trying to chop it down and it's back the next day. Like that would be my luck.
I mean, it is a weed. It is a weed, so it can grow like wildfire.
Like, oh my God. So you also offer educational services aside from consulting. Would you mind telling us more about that, and what can someone gain from taking one of your online courses?
Totally. So as I mentioned earlier, I do have my online course program, The Fundamental Elements of Cannabis Science, and that lives on althea.com, which is an LMS specifically for the cannabis industry, which is cool. So you can also find other courses made by other instructors around growing if you want, and a variety of other topics. But really with our course program, we focused on this question of what does the bud tender need to know in order to best serve the patient or the customer? And so we go through like the indica sativa myth, we go through cannabinoids, terpenes, we go through navigating the hemp CBD market, the ECS, the ensemble effect, cannabis products, and consumption methods. And each course is broken down into multiple modules, and they're all video-based lessons. So you get to see me instructing, and there are
Nice.
assessments and different kind of fun games that we've included, like different, like, like matching card games and other like RPG experiences, which was all really fun. Ultimately, our ethos in creating this was like, we wanted to, yes, have like the highest level of information, but we do not want anybody to feel intimidated or feel like they don't have access to this, because they, maybe haven't taken a science class in a while. We also wanted it to be really whimsical and fun. And so there are like moments of silliness throughout, and we incorporate a lot of like art and animation as well to increase engagement, because the educational offerings that I had seen, before kind of creating this, like, yes, they were bringing some good information to the forefront, but they were really just dry and boring. And I was like, oh, like weed is artistic and silly and creative and fun. And yes, it's so important. And I truly believe that it can have such positive impact. I know it can have such positive impact on people's lives and also the world at large, but it still is fun. It still is weed. And so how do we kind of marry those two ideas together and deliver something that's engaging, but really informative and can ultimately help people go out into the world and help other people who maybe are a little bit more trepidatious around cannabis feel more comfortable and engaging with it as an option. There are so many people out there who could really benefit from cannabis as medicine, but are nervous, and rightfully so. I mean, the war on drugs did a number on people in terms of like brainwashing and manipulation. And so I completely get why there's hesitation there. And what I want to do is, for those who are interested in learning more, and for those who are interested in working in the industry and inspiring other people, just give them the tools to do so. And I found personally and through my work that the best tool is through reason and fact. And that's really how I have put people's, calmed people's fears down, like going to the basics of cannabis. It won't be lethal. It's not going to harm you. It's not going to make you into this horrible person. Let's look at what it actually does based on scientific research, and then help you make an informed decision for what works best for your lifestyle.
Hear, hear.
Pound the gavel.
Yeah. So you also just opened a dispensary. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Please tell us more about it and what kind of products you offer. Also, was opening the dispensary something that you've always wanted to do? And what challenges did you face or are you facing at the moment?
Oh, yes. So I will say that, one, to make the distinction and make it really clear that it is not my dispensary. So while it is, born of like it is totally my creative vision, me and my business partners, like creative vision. And we are the ones who worked with designers to, create the brand identity and the ethos and constructed it. It is still for a client. So I'm not actually involved in like the day-to-day management of it, which I prefer, honestly.
Yeah.
But it was such a labor of love in birthing it to the world. And again, we like resonated on this question and this idea of just like our online school, where we want something that still has like really like wonderful products that are rooted in organics and full spectrum methodology, and display them in a way that scientifically makes sense. So not looking at the indica sativa binary, but looking at terpenes to kind of categorize them on an effect-based scale. But we don't want it to feel so clinical. We want it to be fun. And so we incorporated a lot of art from local artists. One of the large installations being this like multi-sensory wall that focuses on the 6 terpenes, top terpenes found in cannabis varieties, and it's tactile, and it lights up in some places. And really, we wanted each panel of the terpenes to really evoke a feeling of how the terpene would make you feel. And so, for example, like linalool has like this stony koala on it, and it's full of like light purples and lavenders and pinks, and it's really plush and soft to evoke the feeling that linalool can give of like that cozy, sleepy vibe. And it's beautiful. I mean, it really feels like a museum ultimately going through there. And it was such a labor of love. It was incredibly arduous, especially just given the fact that myself and my business partner were entirely responsible for everything from start to finish. And we did it in 7 months, and we relocated to Oklahoma City during a pandemic where we didn't know anybody. And like, it just cost such sacrifice ultimately. And we also ran into a challenge at the end where the clients who we were working for just were not quite on the same page with the kind of mission, and instead were really focusing on that bottom line, as business people do. And that was definitely more than a clue. That was an affirmation for me of like, okay, I do not necessarily belong in the business side of things, in the corporate cannabis world, because so much of my love for cannabis does not involve like for profit necessarily. And what I want to create is definitely more in like the artistic, scientific kind of communities. And so there's a lot of emotions, I'd say, wrapped up into it. Like, on one hand, I'm so proud of it, and it exists, and the staff is amazing. We hired and trained all the staff, and they're incredible, and they're really carrying out the mission. But on the other hand, it was definitely a big kind of wake up call in like, I don't ever need to do this again, which sounds dramatic, but it was also like, I did it. And I think you asked the question, have I always wanted to open a dispensary? And I definitely have, especially since starting at the dispensary. And my business partner, him and I met at the dispensary where we both kind of started at. And so it felt like this very much full circle moment of like, we created something so special and beautiful that like lives on and will evolve and change, of course, as it goes, but also we never need to do this again. We completed that. And also like, maybe it's time to kind of step outside of consulting. And, for me, that next step was going into grad school and really diving more into the scientific research side of things, because that's really where like a lot of my love resides.
I love that.
Thank you.
That's how I feel about podcasting. I'm like, I just love it. I just love talking to people, and I love learning new things.
Yes. It's so fun. And like, when your heart sings about something, you just got to follow the song.
Right? I love that too. Well said.
Life lessons.
Yeah. So, what are your plans now that legalization is making headway in other areas of the country? I understand that you've linked up with the college. Do you care if I say it?
Oh, please go for it.
Thomas Jefferson University. Congrats with that. That's amazing.
Thank you.
What current projects are you working on, and what can we expect to see from you next?
So I'm at Jefferson, which I'm very excited about. I as I said, I'm pursuing my Master's of Science in Medical Cannabis Science and Business. And I just moved to Philadelphia. So I'm a born and raised New Yorker, but then lived in Portland for 6 years. And I'm very new to Philly and bought a house. So I feel like I've been so focusing on like, okay, just establishing myself here, like calling all my energy back and like rooting in where I am and painting my house and, doing all that kind of stuff. But I'm really finding myself noticing what, again, like my heart feels pulled towards in my coursework. And what I'm really loving is my course by Dr. Ward, and it's called Pathology is Potentially Responsive to Cannabis Therapy. And it's wonderful. We learn about all these different diseases, which I've always geeked out over. And then we learn about the research that exists that could point to the way in which cannabinoid-based treatments might be an effective strategy for the treatment of these various disorders, most of which don't really have an effective treatment in Western medicine yet. And so that has been really exciting to just like love that. And I'm not quite sure what is next for me or how, this degree plays out. But as of right now, I'm just like, again, noticing what I love and really where I want to focus my time on. And I think ultimately, and this may change, but I think ultimately I would love to develop some coursework for university level courses after coming out of my master's. And it's really exciting to me to see universities such as Jefferson really, creating and designing course curriculums with wonderful instructors that are taking cannabis and the endocannabinoid system and endocannabinology really seriously. And given my love of education and what I've done thus far, this feels like a natural course to be able to elevate and grow within that path. And so maybe after my master's, we'll want to get a PhD. Maybe we'll kind of try to go right into, teaching and developing some coursework for other undergraduate programs. We'll see. But I'm excited to just feel inspired by cannabis science and cannabis education and the options that lay ahead.
That's amazing. You're wildly educated, and I'm pretty sure you can do anything you want at this point. It's been a half an hour, but I'm like, she could take America.
Oh my God. Thank you.
Like, wow. So what are your thoughts on legalization of cannabis and the potential threat that it could cause to those who sell through the traditional market or the black market? Do you think that the ads will even out on the playing field eventually, or do you think that one is going to take on the other?
I do think that legalization is inevitable. Especially considering that New York and New Jersey are about to go the way of legalization. I think that the Northeast will very quickly follow after that, considering just how many states are kind of clustered up here. Like thinking about Pennsylvania, it's like, oh, well, if you can drive from Philly to New Jersey and get weed, like that, the people are just going to start doing that. So Pennsylvania, right, you might as well move towards an adult use model so that you keep the tax money in the state. And so yes, I do think that legalization is inevitable, but I also think that we can look at New York and hopefully the way that New York continues to operate, that's really focused on social equity, thanks to all of the advocates on the ground there who are working to make that happen and making sure that the New York's program does really like favor and provide access and opportunity for those communities who have been disproportionately marginalized by the war on drugs. And I think that that's how we create reparations within the system to be able to honor that traditional legacy market and the people who have been involved with it and the people who have, really been the ones who have in their own way advocated and created this opportunity for us to even have legal cannabis. And so I think that they definitely deserve a seat at the table, and we just need to develop comprehensive social equity programs that actually work. And I am excited about New York just because New York has put this on the ballot before, and people have shut it down because social equity wasn't included. And seeing the work that people on the ground there have done to make sure that there is a comprehensive social equity program is exciting. And I think that it could show us kind of the roadmap for how we might do that in other states to make sure that we are honoring that traditional market and that nobody is getting left out.
I agree. Absolutely. So what is your take on psilocybin? I know that some people are pretty sensitive. I mean, they're sensitive to weeds, so essentially there's no way they won't be sensitive to that. And do you think that you'd eventually incorporate that into your business?
Totally. Oh, I love psychedelics. I am a big personal user of psychedelics. And I think that actually psychedelics are really fascinating when we look at kind of their path to legalization, because Oregon did pass that ballot measure that will legalize, not only decriminalize, but legalize and regulate psilocybin therapy for adults in Oregon, which is awesome. And it's very cool to see psilocybin and psychedelics in general, including LSD and MDMA and even ketamine, go more of the medical research track rather than cannabis that went very like free market capitalism track. And so we do have, these giants of research like Harvard and Johns Hopkins running these research trials of like psychedelic assisted therapy and really like publishing phenomenal results and incredible findings in regards to the potential for psychedelics to help people, in like trauma recovery, to help people reduce anxiety and depression, to help people reduce like addictive dependencies on other more harmful drugs, and just to help people feel like just better with life. And I think that Oregon is doing something really cool in there's not necessarily, at least as far as I know at this time, there's not necessarily going to be like any like prerequisites that you have to or qualifying conditions that you have to have in order to get access to the psilocybin therapy. You'll need to meet with a therapist for a pre-session and have your session, then do a post-session, but it seems like anybody can do it, anybody 21 plus. And so that's really, really cool. I think that when we're thinking about psychedelics, when I'm thinking about psychedelics, I want to make sure that people everywhere have access to this as it starts to become legal, not just people in more progressive cities. So thinking about, people in rural Kentucky, like how do we get them access to this? How do we get people access to this who otherwise might have been so afraid to, even go there due to the trauma that they've experienced due to the war on drugs? But psychedelics can help to reverse that trauma. So it's really accessing those vulnerable communities that may not otherwise feel like they're a part of it too, I think is going to be a big question moving forward. And a lot of work hopefully will be done to make sure that access is provided. And when it comes to like education around the science of psychedelics, totally here for that. And absolutely am interested in kind of expanding what I talk about and maybe even course offerings in the future regarding the way in which psychedelics like impact the brain. My favorite kind of fact that I've learned just from my own reading is about the default mode network, which is the system in our brain that was like just discovered recently. And it basically is on all of the time. Like 90% of our brain activity goes to this default mode network. And what it is, it's like this super highway that connects all the different parts of our brain so that our brain is just like constantly talking to each other. And it's really important for like self-ideation. It's important when we keep time. It's important when we think about the future and how we relate to the past. And it like never shuts down, but it does shut down and destabilize when we take psychedelics, specifically psilocybin destabilizes this. And so all of a sudden, that's where we lose this sense of self. That's where we lose sense of time. That's where like we can't really relate to any future ideation. And it also completely changes the way that we relate to past. And because the default mode network is shut down, that's also where we get all of this neurogenesis happening. So all of the these new neuronal pathways are being formed, and that's how people can circumvent trauma. That's how people can, relate differently now to their past traumas, because they're able to actually form new connections and see it differently, and then be able to move forward differently. And that's also why scientists think why we have this sort of universal mystical experience when we're on psychedelics, because our DMN, our default mode network, is shut down. And so our brain can't talk to itself. And so all of a sudden we feel more in touch with everything else. So cool. I could literally talk about this forever. I just am fascinated. Like I said at the beginning, I love plant medicine. And actually a lot of my study in undergrad was more around like the ayahuasca and the ibogaine and the more psychedelic, psychotropic, hallucinogenic kind of plants in the way that they would be used in ritual. So I love it.
I could listen to you forever. I think I'm loving this. I'm like, yes. So seeing as you help those out in need within the industry through educating and consulting, what advice would you give someone interested in breaking into the field?
Great question. I think it's one, make as many connections as possible. This industry is definitely run on connections. And so like reach out to people, go to networking events within your community, start showing up. I think that that's the biggest thing, is just show up in your community and start connecting. People really like, in my experience, people really like to help each other out in this industry. And so if there's any way, that somebody that you meet could connect you with somebody else to kind of set you on the path that you want to be on, people will do that for you. And so that's my first token of advice. And then my second is study as much as you can. Really read up on cannabis, like read research articles if that's your thing, watch videos, like just really start to learn about the plant. And so that way, when you are put into certain social situations, you are and come off as educated and like what you're talking about. And I think that it also helps to convey a certain like passion. The more knowledge that you have, to me, it's whenever I kind of hear someone speak who really seems to know their shit, I'm like, oh yeah, they've spent time learning this. They really do care. And my final piece of advice is don't be afraid to start at the bottom of the totem pole, quote unquote. I started as a bud tender thinking that it would be temporary, and it really blossomed into something so much more. And for that, I'm very grateful. It took a lot of hustle, a lot of drive, a lot of showing up to places and making connections. But it was because I, took that job. I said yes to that $12 an hour job. And so like, even if that's not where you want to end up, that's okay. You need to start somewhere. And so start somewhere and then do what you got to do to get to where you want to be.
Amen to that. I'm always like a big reader, and I'm always like, read anything you can.
Yes.
Like it's
just absorb the knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Last but not least, where can our friends find you?
You can find me on Instagram. I'm just Emma Chasen there. You can also find all of my kind of course offerings and way to get in touch with me on the business side of things at my website, which is eminentconsultingfirm.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. You are wildly educated, brilliant, and a woman in weed that we love. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been such a pleasure and so fun to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And make sure you follow her, follow us. Let's all be friends. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you guys for listening once again. I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. Emma Chasen. Make sure you follow her on her Instagram at Emma Chasen, CHASEN. Make sure you follow her, like and subscribe, and also follow us. Tell your friends. Let's all be friends.